The most powerful human battleship ever built, banned by the galaxy. The chair does not fit. Not dramatically, not in a way that would give me grounds to formally object, but enough that every time I shift my weight, it reminds me of the fact. The Concordat has been designing furniture for 200 years and has still not figured out human proportions. I decided not to mention it. The lead arbitrator across from me is Verith, pale, long-limbed, with 4 eyes that never quite look at the same point at the same time. He places a data slate on the table between us and says, in the careful translation layer voice they all use for formal proceedings, "Commander Vaughn, you are charged under Concordat Resolution 7714C with the unlawful construction, concealment and deployment of a weapons platform classified as an existential tier threat to galactic stability. Please begin at the beginning." I look at the slate. I look at him. I look at the 22 other species representatives seated in a curved row behind him, all of them watching me with the specific attention of people who have been made very uncomfortable and want someone named for it. The beginning, I say. Yes. 14 colonies, 6 hours. The Concordat sent a statement. The room goes still. Not politely still, the kind of still that happens when someone says a true thing in a space full of people who had been hoping it would not come up. That was the Karath incident, the arbitrator says carefully. That was Karath, I say. Everything I'm about to tell you starts there. If you want the story without Karath in it, you are going to need a different witness. I was 41 when it happened. I was sitting in a monitoring station at Shipyard Epsilon 9, running standard diagnostics on a patrol-class vessel, when the signal started dropping. 1 colony, then 3, then 7. By the time the count reached 14, I had stopped doing anything at all. I was just watching numbers disappear from a screen, one after another, each one representing a population center, an infrastructure grid, 40,000 people, or 60,000 people, or 12,000 people, just going dark the way a light goes dark when you flip a switch. The response from the Galactic Concordat came 48 hours later. A formal statement expressing deep concern, a call for restraint from all parties involved, a promise to investigate the circumstances and present findings to the Assembly within a reasonable period. I read it once, then I went back to work. Not the diagnostic work, different work. I called Owen Clark first. Owen was the head of theoretical propulsion at Epsilon 9. A quiet man from Cornwall who wore the same grey jacket every day regardless of the temperature, and had a documented habit of solving problems that major institutions had shelved as impossible, usually on napkins before his first coffee was finished. I told him I had an idea. He said, "How serious is it?" I said, "In terms of what it will do or in terms of what they will say about us when they find out?" He thought about that for a moment. "Both, I suppose." "Very," I said. "And very." He asked when we were starting. I told him we already had. He said he would clear his schedule and come by after lunch, and he did. And we talked for 4 hours, and by the end of it, the shape of the thing existed in both our heads, even if it would take 11 years to make it real. The budget authorization was buried inside a standard infrastructure renewal proposal, Defensive Systems Research and Development, Epsilon 9 Long Cycle Initiative. 11 lines in a document 400 pages long. Nobody reads 400-page documents. That is a lesson the Concordat itself taught us incidentally. They write long documents specifically so that the important lines disappear into the bulk of the unimportant ones. We had been paying attention. The core team was 12 people. Owen Clark on drive systems, Cal Preston on hull architecture, Nina Hartwell on weapons theory, Sam Doyle on power distribution. The rest filled specialized roles that I will not list here for reasons that remain classified at the highest tier. All of them had been doing their work for more than 2 decades. All of them had been at their stations the day Karuth happened. None of them needed me to explain what we were building or why. The first full meeting lasted 14 hours. We did not talk about what we were building as a weapon. We talked about it as a problem. The problem being, what would it actually take to make sure that what happened at Karuth could never happen again? Not deterrence in the diplomatic sense. Not a statement of capability filed in an official record somewhere. an actual, functional, deployable solution. Cal said it plainest, the way Cal always did. Every ship in the Concordate fleet is built to intimidate. They are designed to look powerful enough that nobody tests them seriously. Nobody has actually needed to fire one in 60 years because the design philosophy is visibility. Look at what I have. Fear what I might do. He paused for a long time. We need to build something that wins when it fires. Not something that looks like it might, something that does. That was the philosophy, not intimidation, not posture, actual terminal capability. Nina had spent 3 weeks before the meeting studying every weapons treaty the Concordate had established over its 2-century history. The yield limits, calibration requirements, propulsion restrictions, prohibited materials lists. She had also, during those 3 weeks, found every gap in all of them. Not loopholes in the legal sense, engineering gaps. Places where the treaty language described what existing technology could do and said nothing about approaches that no Concordate species had thought to try. They wrote these treaties, she said, placing a tablet on the table, based on their own physics, their own engineering assumptions. They prohibited the things they could imagine. They did not ask what we might imagine because for most of their history, we were not there to ask. She had a list. 43 specific engineering approaches that were technically legal under existing Concordate treaty language because no drafting committee had considered them possible. She called it the gap list. We called it the blueprint. The ship that came out of that gap list was not the largest vessel humanity had ever built. Not the fastest, not the most heavily armored. It was, as Nina put it with the particular precision she used when she meant something entirely, the most efficient delivery system for terminal force ever assembled by any species in this region of the galaxy. The primary weapon system was called the Meridian Array. I will describe it as simply as I can since the tribunal asked for simple terms. Standard weapons fire something at a target. A beam, a projectile, an energy discharge of one type or another. The Meridian Array does not fire anything at a target. What it does is apply a sustained, precise, and localized shift in the fundamental energy state of a defined volume of space. What that means in practical terms, I will get to shortly. The hull was built from an alloy that Cal and Nina developed together in the 3rd year of construction. It combined 2 materials that no Concordate species had ever combined, for the straightforward reason that no Concordate species had ever had reason to put those materials in the same room together. The resulting alloy absorbed energy rather than deflecting it, not just weapons fire, light, radar signals, sensor pulses. Under the right conditions, the ship was effectively invisible to every standard detection system in the Concordate arsenal. The final bonding process for the alloy was solved by a graduate student we had brought on for an unrelated material study. Her name was Fiona Grant. She was 23 years old, and she solved the problem in 11 days, and I gave her a commendation that did not specify what it was for. 11 years total, 17 major redesigns. The drive system alone went through 6 full iterations because Owen kept finding ways to improve the speed that required rebuilding the structural frame, and Cal kept finding structural improvements that required rethinking the drive housing. They had the same argument about this approximately 400 times over the course of the build. It was always productive. 4 workers were lost during construction. Their names were Pete Aldridge, Dan Marsh, Will Keane, and Leon Price. I said their names at the commissioning. I am saying them again here. By the time the build was complete, she massed 900,000 tons, carried a crew of 412, mounted armament arrays across 11 weapon classes, and had at her center the Meridian Array. She had been built around 43 things the Concordate had not thought to prohibit. She had been built in 11 years of silence. She had been built because 14 colonies went dark in 6 hours, and the response was a statement. She had no name. One of the engineers asked about that in the final week of construction, when the last hull section was being sealed. She looked up at 900,000 tons of everything we had been able to think of, sitting dark and enormous in the dock, and she asked what we were going to call her. I looked at the hull for a long time, at the scale of it, at what it represented, at the math that had led here from the moment the 14th signal dropped. Something they will remember, I said. The test was scheduled for Tuesday. Nobody picks meaningful days for this kind of work. You pick ordinary days that look like every other day in the schedule, so that anyone scanning the calendar does not see anything worth flagging. The morning of the test looked exactly like the morning of every other day at Epsilon 9. Owen ran the pre-fire systems check himself. It took 6 hours and came back clean across every board. He told me so in a message that contained no other words, just the status confirmation. That was how Owen communicated when he was focused. The test site was a decommissioned asteroid in a deep space uninhabited sector. 3 light minutes from the nearest occupied anything. Its mass had been precisely logged before we selected it. We had chosen it because it was large enough that standard weapons would visibly damage it without destroying it. We needed scale. We needed something big enough that the results would be unambiguous at every level of the spectrum. The ship's captain for the test was Lieutenant Commander Yeva Osai. She was 29 years old. She had been 7 years old during Karith. I did not know that detail at the time. She told me much later. It explained something about the way she spoke to her crew that day, steady and precise. No weight in her voice that did not need to be there. Every word earns its place. I watched from the observation station at Epsilon 9. Real-time feed, minimal delay. Owen stood on my left. Nina stood on my right. Cal was somewhere behind us. I did not look back to confirm. Stage 1. The standard armament arrays. The asteroid took hits across its northern hemisphere. Deep fractures. Significant material ejection into local space. The kind of damage you see in combat exercise footage, dramatic and visible, and in the grand calculus of what we were building, entirely unremarkable. Recoverable damage. That is the treaty-compliant loadout, Nina said, eyes on her tablet rather than the screen. Everything they know we have. She scrolled to the next set of parameters. Now, the interesting part, she said. Stage 2, the Meridian Array at 12% capacity. I watched the feed. I did not blink. The asteroid did not fracture in places. It fractured everywhere simultaneously. Every point on its surface registered a stress response at exactly the same moment, as though something had reached inside the entire mass at once and disagreed with it at a level below what standard physics had expected. The fracture line spread from within, not from a point of impact. There was no point of impact. There was just the asteroid. And then there was the asteroid experiencing structural failure from the inside out at every coordinate simultaneously. Nobody in the observation room said anything. 12%, Owen said finally. 12, Nina confirmed. Stage 3 was not in the original test schedule. Nina had added it the night before. She had come to me with a tablet and a completely calm face and said she wanted to run the array up to 31%. I asked her why 31 specifically. She said the math indicated it remained within technically controlled parameters. I asked what the math said about 32. She considered this for a moment and said she did not know yet. I approved 31. Yeva's voice came through the feed. Calm. Unhurried. The voice of a person doing a job that they have prepared for. Meridian Array charging to 31%, firing on my mark. I watched the asteroid feed. It was there. The array fired. It was not there. Not fragments, not an expanding debris field radiating from a central point, not dust or gas, or any of the things that ordinarily fill the space where a large object used to be. The feed showed empty space. Clean, undisturbed, ordinary empty space. The asteroid had been there, and then the array had fired, and the space where the asteroid had been looked identical to all the space around it, as though nothing had ever occupied that volume. As though the problem of the asteroid's existence had been politely, but completely solved. Someone in the room sat down on the floor without finding a chair first. I heard it happen. I did not look to see who. Cal started laughing, quietly at first, and then not quietly. The kind of laughing that is not about something being funny. I ran the numbers on my tablet, the asteroid's pre-fire mass against the post-fire sensor readings. I ran them again, then a third time. The numbers said the same thing all 3 times, which meant the numbers were right, which meant we had built something that worked considerably better than the most optimistic projections had suggested. Owen looked at my tablet, then at me. He said, "Well?" "Yeah," I said. "Time to name her," he said. "Not yet," I said. "But almost." The footage reached the Concordate within 2 weeks. I had expected it to take longer. Every person on that project had been vetted to an extreme. The leak happened anyway, and I said, "Somewhere in the chain," when the tribunal asked about it. And I will continue to say that, and I will continue not to elaborate. The first contact came 72 hours after the footage was confirmed as authentic, not a formal diplomatic request. Not a scheduled communication submitted through the standard channel protocols that the Concordate uses for everything, including the scheduling of the scheduling meetings. A direct, unannounced channel opening from the Verith High Council to Earth's Foreign Relations Office at 3 hours in the morning station time. The fastest communication the Concordate had ever initiated with a human government. I want that to be clear. 200 years of established protocol, and they bypassed all of it for a 72-hour response to footage of a weapons test. Owen read the transcript to me over breakfast. He read it straight through, put it down on the table, and we sat there in silence for a moment. "They are not angry," I said. "No," he said. "They are scared." "Yes." That was the detail that mattered, not of the weapons capability specifically. Every Concordate species had weapons of genuine destructive capacity. What frightened them was the silence. 11 years of construction, the gap list, the fact that we had looked at 200 years of their treaties and found 43 things they had not thought to prohibit, and had built a ship around those 43 things, and had said nothing, and had been sitting at the same table as them all along. What frightened them was not knowing what else we might be thinking. Intelligence assessments from 3 Concordate species were recovered through diplomatic channels and entered into the tribunal record. The Verith had tasked their chief weapons scientist with determining how long it would take their own engineers to replicate the Meridian Array. Her answer was that they did not know what field of physics to begin studying. The mechanism sat entirely outside their theoretical models. She added one unprompted line at the end of her report. It said, in translation, "This was not built by a species that recently discovered engineering. This was built by a species that has been thinking differently than us for a very long time, quietly." I read that and felt something I did not name and did not need to. The naming ceremony was 6 days after the Verith contact. Quiet. Core team only, plus Yeva. No formal ceremony, no speeches, no record beyond the names on the attendance sheet. We stood in Dock 17 at Epsilon 9, and we looked at 900,000 tons of the thing we had built, and then we named her with brushes and paint and a stepladder. Unconditional surrender. Not anyone surrendered specifically. Not a statement directed at any particular party. Just the concept sitting in white paint on black hull, 900,000 tons of implication behind it. Owen stood back and looked at it for a long moment. He said, "That is going to make them very uncomfortable." "Good," I said. Yeva said nothing. She looked at the name for a long time and then she nodded once. The way people nod when something is exactly right and there is nothing useful to add to it. The M-Hen Collective's response to the footage was different from the Verith. Where the Verith had reached out in 72 hours, the M-Hen took 4 days. When they did communicate, they did not contact Earth's government directly. They went to the Concordate and requested an emergency full assembly session regarding, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, the unilateral human development of a weapons platform constituting an unacceptable alteration to galactic stability. Unacceptable alteration to galactic stability. I read that phrase 3 times. The M-Hen Collective had 17 active warships in disputed sectors at the time of that statement. They had occupied 2 resource extraction zones without treaty authorization in the previous decade. Their diplomatic record contained 6 formal violations and over 20 informal ones. They were calling us a threat to galactic stability. Nina heard about it and laughed. Then she stopped laughing because it was not funny. Then she started again because sometimes the laugh is the only rational response available. The emergency session was held at Concordat Prime Station, a structure the size of a small city orbiting a star that technically belonged to no one, which made it the favored venue for confrontations that everyone wanted on neutral ground. 23 species, 6 simultaneous translation matrices running continuously, and a chair that did not fit my proportions. I noticed the chair immediately upon sitting in it. I decided once again not to mention it. Owen was on my left. Our lead diplomat, Petra Walsh, was on my right. She was sharp, careful, and had been reading concordant legal precedents since well before breakfast on the flight over. She had a plan. Her plan was good. I was going to use part of it and discard another part of it, and she knew that, and she had built her plan accordingly. The Verith arbitrator opened the session with a summary of the situation framed in language that was technically accurate and tonally designed to present humanity as a problem that had materialized without warning in a previously stable environment. He was good at this. I gave him credit for the craft of it. The Verith representative spoke first from the floor. She was formal and precise, and cited the Concord of Aleth, the primary weapons limitation treaty that formed the backbone of Concordat arms policy. She cited yield thresholds and calibration requirements and 3 separate resolutions passed in the previous 30 years, restricting development activity by non-alliance species. She cited them clearly and in sequence, and with evident confidence in their relevance. I wrote 2 words on the notepad in front of me. Carith, 200 years. The Concordat of Aleth had been signed 2 centuries before Carith. It has not been updated since. The Doral representative spoke second, ancient grey, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has seen so much history that he no longer feels the need to rush through any of it. He said, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere very settled and far away, that the unconditional surrender represented a threshold crossing. That a weapons platform of this nature, once built, changed the strategic calculus for every species, not just humanity. That this required careful, measured collective response. He did not mention Carith. I wrote 3 more words under the first 2, measured, careful, collective. Then I drew a small box around all 5 words and looked at them for a moment. The Mhan collective delegate was third. He stood for his address, standing as a dominance posture in Mhan formal culture. They are aware of this and continue doing it, and said that humanity's construction of a weapons platform without concordat notification or approval demonstrated a clear and documented intent toward unilateral galactic dominance. He used the word intent 4 times in 7 sentences. He used the word threat 3 times. He did not use the word careth once. Petra rose and delivered her response with the precision of someone who has prepared well and knows it. She walked through humanity's legal position point by point. No existing treaty required prior concordat approval for defensive research and development. The Concordat of Aleth's yield thresholds applied specifically to weapons employed in a treaty-regulated conflict context, not to systems in, and the Concordat's proposed resolution contained no enforcement mechanism that could be practically applied against a non-alliance member acting within its own sovereign territory. She was correct on every point. She sat down and looked at me. I stood up. I would like to read something, I said. The arbitrator said, "This session is structured for formal statements and it is short," I said. "Relatively." I had the text memorized. I recited from memory the Concordat's complete official response to the Carith massacre. All of it. Every sentence. The expression of deep concern, the call for restraint, the promise of investigation. The follow-up statement issued 60 days later, noting that the investigation was ongoing. The final statement issued 8 months after the event, closing the investigation with findings described as inconclusive pending further developments. It took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The room held a silence that had weight to it. When I finished, I said, "That is the complete official record. Those were all the words." I looked across the assembled delegates. 14 colonies, 6 hours. I looked directly at the Mhan delegate. That is the record you want to have this conversation on. I said the word Karath once into absolute silence. I wanted it in the record, I said, and sat down. The session ran for 6 more hours after that. Statements, counterstatements, legal frameworks, technical objections, procedural motions. Petra handled most of it, and was excellent. But the moment that remained in the room that I watched affected every delegate in different but visible ways for the rest of the day. Those 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The vote at the end of the session passed 21-2. The unconditional surrender was to be placed in permanent, non-operational storage under Concordat seal. Her weapon systems were to be removed. The Meridian Array schematics were to be transferred to a joint custody Concordat archive. Earth's government agreed to storage. Not decommission, not schematic destruction, storage. The Concordat accepted these terms because the alternative was to not accept them. And the unconditional surrender was sitting operational in a dock on Earth at that moment with a crew that had drilled for scenarios that existed in no standard tactical manual. Nobody stated this reasoning aloud. They did not need to. After the session in the corridor outside the hall, the Doral representative approached me. Moving slowly as always, he stopped in front of me and stood for a moment looking at a point somewhere to my left. "Commander Vorn," he said. "Representative, a question off the formal record if you would permit it. Go ahead. How many vessels of this class is humanity capable of constructing?" I had been waiting for this question. Not specifically from the Doral, but I had known it was coming from someone. I had thought about my answer for several weeks. Not the truthful answer, the useful answer. The one that did the most work in the fewest words and left the right amount of space for the imagination to fill. I looked at him for a long moment. "We stopped at 1, I said. I let that sit in the air between us. "On purpose," I added, and I walked away down the corridor without looking back. I do not know what the Doral representative did after that. I have thought about those 5 seconds probably more than any other 5 seconds in this entire account, because I believe that exchange changed something in the way the Concordat thought about us. Not the ship, us. The gap between what we were capable of and what we chose to do. We had built one. We had chosen to stop. Not because a treaty required it. Not because we lacked resources or time or engineering capacity. We made that choice ourselves for our own reasons. And then we sat down in rooms with the people who were frightened of us and behaved like partners in a shared system. I do not know whether that made them more comfortable or less. My honest estimate is less, but less for the right reasons. The unconditional surrender was sealed into Storage Dock 17 at Epsilon 9 on the 43rd day following the session. Full Concordat oversight team present, sensors at every access point. The sealing process takes 8 hours from first lock to final certification. Yeva stood down the crew station by station, system by system until the ship was dark and silent in her berth. She did it without ceremony, without drama. You do the job in front of you, whether that job is bringing a ship to life or putting her to sleep. The last system to go dark was the navigation array. Yeva shut it down herself. The dock is sealed. I stood outside and held something in my head. Not a plan. Plans require commitment. This was more like math. The kind you carry in the back of your mind without writing it down because writing it down forces a decision you are not ready to make yet. Simple math. What it would take to wake her up again. What conditions would have to exist. What the authorization chain required. 47 minutes from first signature to final. 14 signatures total. I had the list memorized. I walked back to my office and went back to work. 7 years. That was how long the seal held. 7 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The unconditional surrender sat in Storage Dock 17, while the Concordat oversight team rotated on 6-month schedules, and Earth's government filed compliance reports on the required timeline. And the official record showed full cooperation with the terms of Resolution 7714C. Yvette took a teaching post at the Naval Academy. Owen returned to propulsion theory, and by all accounts continued solving problems on napkins. Cal retired to the coast somewhere and sent occasional messages containing photographs of weather. Nina started a research consultancy that produced work she never published in any accessible journal, which told me everything I needed to know about what the work was. I stayed at Epsilon 9. Different work, maintenance oversight, system certification, scheduling, the ordinary administrative weight of keeping a large shipyard operational. I stayed because I did not want to be far from Dock 17 when the math became relevant. I did not tell anyone that was the reason, but it was. 7 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Then, the MHen Collective moved on to New Harwich. New Harwich was a human frontier settlement in a sector the Concordat had classified as contested for over 2 decades, without ever resolving the contestation in any meaningful way. 40,000 residents, primarily agricultural and processing operations, sitting in a zone that had been generating formal diplomatic complaints and formal diplomatic responses and formal diplomatic files for 3 years before the first MHen patrol incursion registered in the area. I had read those files, all of them. I had sent a memo to the relevant oversight committee 14 months before the incident flagging the pattern, describing what the pattern historically preceded, asking for a response that went beyond a formal acknowledgement. I received a formal acknowledgement within the standard response window. The signal from New Heritage went dark on a Wednesday morning at 6:20 station time. By noon, a second settlement, 40 light minutes away, had gone silent. I was at my desk when the third signal dropped at 18:40 that evening. I had a cup of coffee in my hand. I set it down. I looked at the screen for a moment. The pattern was identical to what I had flagged 14 months earlier, identical to other patterns I had studied in detail. Identical in the ways that mattered most to a pattern I had watched unfold when I was 41 years old, and the count ran to 14. I picked up the communicator and called Petra Walsh. "How long?" I said. She knew exactly what I was asking. "The committee is convening. There is a ceasefire framework being drafted. The Concordat has already issued a request for restraint from all." Petra. A pause. 72 hours minimum before anything with real force is in place. Realistically, 96. I said, "Thank you," and ended the call. Then I sat for 90 seconds doing nothing at all, which is longer than it sounds when you are counting. Then I started making calls. The authorization chain for unsealing storage Dock 17 required 14 signatures. Some were administrative, some military, 2 were political, 1 was civilian oversight. I had the list memorized and had kept it current through the 7 years of maintenance rotation, updating for personnel changes, making sure I always knew exactly who to call and in what order. The first signature came through in 11 minutes, the second in 4. The third was a general I had briefed twice in the previous 2 years on exactly this class of scenario. And when I explained what was happening on the frontier, he said, "Proceed," before I finished my second sentence. I worked through the list while the overnight hours ticked forward, and the situation reports from the frontier kept arriving with the regularity of something that has been carefully planned and is executing as intended. The 12th and 13th signatures came together from a 2-person authorization board. 9 minutes of deliberation that I was not party to, then both simultaneously confirmed. The 14th was the hardest, not politically, personally. His name was Adrian Cross. He was a civilian oversight representative who had opposed the ship's construction from the earliest stages, had voted for the storage order at the Concordat session, and had spent 7 years believing in good faith that the diplomatic option was always the one that had not yet been fully tried. He was not wrong as a general principle. He was a good man. He picked up immediately when I called. I told him what was happening. The 3 signals, the timeline, the pattern, the 96 hours it would take to put a formal framework in place. He said, "If we unseal her, the Concordat response will be..." "Adrian," I said. The M-hand ran numbers. They calculated that our most capable asset was legally and politically off the board. They made a strategic decision based on that calculation. They decided it worked out in their favor. A silence. They need to learn, I said, that they calculated wrong. 14 signatures, 47 minutes total. I was at Dock 17 when the seals cycled open. The access points were released one by one in sequence, each one making a sound that was more felt than heard. A deep mechanical exhale running down the length of the dock as 7 years of sealed pressure equalized. The interior lighting came back online in stages. The faint glow visible through the released gaps grew stronger as the ship's systems began their wake cycle. She sounded different waking up after 7 years. Every system coming to life has a signature frequency, a vibration that registers in the bones before it reaches the ears. She sounded the way a person sounds when they have been waiting for a long time and they finally hear the sound they were waiting for. I am aware that this is not a technical description. It is nevertheless accurate. I had reached Yeva 40 minutes into the authorization process. She had asked one question. Full complement. 412, I said. Give me 24 hours. You are 16. 24, she said. Her full crew was aboard in 19 hours. I did not point this out. The unconditional surrender left. Epsilon 9 dock at 3:40 station time with no escort, no fleet formation, no advance notification filed with the Concordat. One ship on a heading for the frontier, and then continuing past it, heading for M-Hen collective space. The Concordat detected the departure within 6 hours. The response was immediate, formal, and operating at a register that I would describe as the diplomatic equivalent of someone running into a room and forgetting why they came. Owen, watching feeds from his retirement, sent me a message. It said only, "Here we go." The M-Hen Collective's outer sensor network registered the unconditional surrender approximately 4 hours after she crossed their territorial boundary. Their command center received the detection report, ran a confirmation check, ran it again, and spent 12 minutes in internal communication that I have read the records of and will simply describe as high intensity. They had 47 warships in the operational area, well-maintained vessels with capable crews and solid tactical doctrine. They formed up in a standard intercept pattern around the incoming contact, 47-1. Their fleet commander opened a communication channel. His voice through the translation layer was composed. He had run his numbers. His numbers had told him he held a significant advantage. He addressed the unconditional surrender directly. "You are one vessel," he said. Yeva looked at the tactical feed showing 47 warships in formation ahead of her. "That is all we needed," she said. I was watching the tactical feed from Epsilon 9 real time. I had coffee in front of me and had not touched it since the call began. Yeva did not charge the formation. She did not posture or maneuver for position. She held at the edge of their operational range and began powering up the Meridian array. There is a specific energy signature to the array coming online. The Concordat had documented it from the original test footage and distributed the recognition parameters to every member species. It was in every Concordat military recognition database. The M-Hen had it too. Their sensor operators read the signature the moment it appeared, flagged it to Tactical Command, and Tactical Command ran numbers. The numbers said things that Tactical Command did not enjoy. Yvetha designated a target volume of empty space between the unconditional surrender and the M-Hen fleet, but on the M-Hen side of the midpoint. Nothing there. No ship, no object, no debris, just space. She fired at 12%. The space changed. Not explosively. Not in any way that would register on a visual feed. On sensors, the energy state of that volume shifted measurably, held for 3 seconds, and then returned to baseline. To anything watching on sensors, and the entire M-Hen fleet was watching on sensors, it looked, for those 3 seconds, like a section of ordinary space had briefly become something that was not ordinary space. Then it returned to normal. Render of equations had not moved his fleet. He was still on the channel. "Commander Osai," he said. His voice had changed register slightly. "Commander Yvetha said, you fired at empty space." "I fired at space," Yvetha said. "I wanted you to see what it looks like before I fire at something that occupies space." 23 seconds of silence. The fleet did not move. Then Render of Equations said, quietly and without any of the formality with which he had opened the channel. "What do you want?" Yeva told him. "The 3 settlements, full and immediate evacuation of M-Hen military presence, concordant arbitration for the underlying territorial disputes conducted under a framework both parties would agree to in advance, reparations to be negotiated through that same framework." Render of Equations said he needed to consult with his command authority. Yeva gave him 1 hour. He took 51 minutes. When the channel reopened, he agreed to all terms pending formal framework establishment. The unconditional surrender returned to dock without firing a second shot. I watched her come in. Same berth, same dark hull absorbing light rather than reflecting it, outlined by what surrounded her rather than by what she was. Not a mark on her. She looked identical to the ship that had entered that dock under seal 7 years earlier, and there was something in that, in the fact that she had gone out and done exactly what she was built to do and come back entirely intact, that I did not have a word for and did not try to find one. Yeva walked out with her crew and found me standing at the dock entrance. She looked at me for a moment, and I looked at her. 11 years since the first test. She had been 29 then. "She performed," Yeva said. "She did," I said. 3 settlements, she said. 40,000 people, I said. We stood in that for a moment. "I was 7, she said. I knew what she meant. I did not say anything. There is nothing useful to say to that, and Yeva was not the kind of person who needed anything useful said to her. She went to run her crew debrief. I went back to my desk. I kept the math in my head, the same math field in the same place. You do not put out one fire and assume there will never be another. That is not pessimism. That is just doing the math, honestly." The tribunal had been running for 6 days when I reached this point in my account. 6 days of testimony, cross-examination, technical review, and formal statements from 23 species representatives. All of them wanted to be on record as having raised concerns before whatever came next arrived. The arbitrator asked for a closing statement. I looked at the room. The Verath arbitrator, with his 4 eyes that never looked at the same thing simultaneously. The Doral representative, who had barely moved in 6 days and looked as though he might not for another century. The Emin delegate who did not render equations. He had been replaced following the settlement, which communicated something specific about how the M-Hen collective handled commanders who did not prevent unfavorable outcomes. I looked at the chair that still did not fit. "You want me to argue for her," I said. "That is what you are expecting from this moment. The part where I make the case that the ship should remain operational, that humanity requires her continued existence, that we reserve the right to use her again." I looked at the arbitrator. "That is not what I am here to do." He made a note. "What I am going to do, instead," I said, "tell you something true, and then you can deliberate and vote and do what you were always going to do." The room was attentive in the way rooms are when the person speaking is not performing attentiveness back at them. "The unconditional surrender was never supposed to be used," I said. "That is the thing this proceeding has missed. The assumption baked into every statement made in this room over 6 days is that we built her to use her. That deployment to the frontier proves aggressive intent, that sending her toward the M-Hen collective was some form of escalation. But that is not what she was built for." The M-Hen delegate began to speak. I raised one hand. "Let me finish." Silence. "Every deterrent ever built in the history of this conquered act was designed to be visible, large, imposing, parked at a border or a disputed sector where everyone could see it and know it was there. That is a threat properly defined. A deterrent says, look at what I have, be deterred by what I might do. The unconditional surrender was not that. She sat in a sealed dock for 7 years. We did not park her at anyone's border and dare them to cross it. I looked at the M-Hen delegate steadily. She sat sealed and dark and silent until someone decided, because our most significant asset was legally and politically off the board, that they could move on 40,000 people with no meaningful consequence. Someone ran numbers, and the numbers came back favorable. We unsealed the ship because the numbers were wrong, and someone needed to demonstrate that clearly. The room held its quiet. We did not build her to threaten. We built her to solve a specific problem. The problem is, when a large enough force moves against a small enough target, no one in a position to help has an option that makes the math work. The cost of intervention is always higher than the cost of a statement. The unconditional surrender exists so that problem has a solution. So the calculation does not work out the way it worked out at Kara. So the MHEN commander runs his numbers and gets different answers. She worked. The settlements are standing. No one fired a meaningful shot. That is the ship doing the precise thing she was designed to do. Not threaten, not dominate. Change the calculation before it runs to completion. The Varath arbitrator said carefully, "Commander, the resolution before this body addresses the precedent established by a single species possessing unilateral capability of this magnitude, regardless of the specific deployment context." "I understand the resolution," I said. "I read it before you convened this session." I leaned back. "Here is the true thing I promised you." Every representative in the curved row shifted in some way, each according to the physical vocabulary of their species, but all of them shifted. You could tell this was what they had been waiting for. Every species in this room has now seen the Meridian Array fire. You have the original test footage. You have the sensor data from the Frontier engagement. You have 6 days of technical testimony with system specifications entered into the record. You are all intelligent. Some of you are brilliant. Some of the engineering institutions represented in this room have been operating for longer than humanity has had written language. I looked across all of them. Give it 100 years, maybe 50. Someone in this room develops the theoretical framework to understand what they saw. Maybe it begins as a defense study. Maybe it begins as a classified academic exercise. It does not matter how it begins. What matters is where it ends, and it ends with someone building their own version, and someone else after that. And eventually, someone points one at someone they have a particular reason not to like. The Doral representative was looking at a point to my left, with the stillness of something very old that has learned how to listen. So decommission her. Dismantle her if you want. Put the Meridian Array schematics in your joint custody archive and call it controlled. Do all of that. It will make this room feel better about what is in the record. I looked at the Doral directly. Have the conversation you are actually afraid to have. Not about the ship, about what the ship represents. About the fact that we figured out something you did not. And the only reason we are sitting in this room having a structured proceeding instead of doing something considerably worse with that advantage is because we chose not to. And you cannot write a treaty that keeps that choice true. That is a decision we make. And it is a decision the next civilization makes when they figure it out in 50 years. And the one after that. The room was as quiet as it had been during those 4 minutes and 20 seconds of Karas's official record, read aloud. "The ship is not the problem," I said. "She is what happens when the actual problem does not get solved. She is the answer to a question that should never have been asked. The question being, what do you do when the people who are supposed to care about 14 colonies send a statement?" I stopped. "Vote however you are going to vote," I said. "I have said what I came to say." The deliberation lasted 6 weeks. I was back at Epsilon 9 for all of it, doing the ordinary work of keeping a shipyard running. Owen called periodically with updates. Petra managed the formal channels with the precision and patience that had defined her entire career. The vote, when it came, was 21-2. The unconditional surrender was to be permanently decommissioned. The hull would be maintained in secure storage pending a formal dismantling timeline. The Meridian Array schematics would remain in joint concordant custody at the highest classification tier, not to be destroyed. Not destroyed. That was the detail that mattered. They had looked at what was in that archive and understood on some level that destroying it was not the same as making it not exist. The knowledge was in the record. The knowledge was in 6 days of tribunal testimony. The knowledge was in the heads of everyone who had been in that room, and in the reports those people had sent to their respective governments, and in the research programs that had quietly started in at least 4 Concordat member states in the 7 months since the Frontier deployment. I read the resolution, filed it. Then I called Nina. She said, "You are not going to contest it." "No," I said. "She did what she needed to do." "She did," I said. "The settlements are still standing. 40,000 people," I said. We stayed on the line without talking for a moment. The way you do when what has been said is enough, and adding to it would only reduce it. Then Nina said she had work to get back to and ended the call. That was Nina. You say the necessary thing, and then you go back to work. I put the communicator down and looked out my office window at the dock. Dock 17 was visible from this angle in this light. Sealed bay, dark inside. I went that evening. I had decided it would be the last time, though I had told no one that. The access was not yet restricted. The formal dismantling timeline had not been set. The Concordat oversight team was between rotation schedules. I walked to the entrance, pressed my hand to the panel, and the door opened. She was dark inside, minimal ambient lighting, just enough to navigate by. The hall was as it had always been, absorbing light rather than offering it back, present in the shape of the space around her rather than in any visible surface of her own. The name was still on the hall in faded white paint, unconditional surrender. The letters had aged in storage, not badly. The lines were still clean. You could still read it from across the dock without difficulty. I stood there and did not try to organize what I was thinking into anything coherent. I thought about Pete Aldrich and Dan Marsh and Will Keane and Leon Price, and I said their names quietly because I had made a habit of that and intended to keep it. I thought about 14 colonies and a statement. I thought about an asteroid that stopped existing at 31%. I thought about Yevgeny saying, "I was 7," in a voice that did not ask for anything in response. A young Concordat aide found me there. Verath, young enough that she had been born after Kareth, old enough to be assigned to the tribunal support staff. She had clearly followed me at some distance and stopped a few feet away looking at the hall. "May I ask you something, Commander?" she said. "Go ahead." "Do you regret it, building her?" I looked at the faded name on the hall. She stopped the situation from becoming Kareth again. I said, "She did it without a prolonged engagement, without losses on either side. The settlements are intact. 40,000 people went home." I looked at the aide. She also did not start anything. No war, no cascading crisis, no dead on either side of that standoff. I looked back at the hull. That is the part that is difficult to put in a record. Records show what happened. They do not easily show what did not happen because something existed to prevent it. The aide was quiet for a moment. Then, the Concordat is classifying her as the most dangerous vessel ever constructed. "She probably is," I said. "Does that bother you?" I thought about that honestly, the way the question deserved. It would bother me, I said, if dangerous and wrong were the same thing. I put my hand on the hull once. The metal was no longer cold the way it had been in the open dock during construction. 7 years of ambient warmth had settled into it. She felt different than she used to. Not worse, just changed by the time she had spent waiting. I walked toward the exit without looking back. The aide followed a few steps behind. At the door I stopped, not for drama, just because a thought needed finishing. She was never going to be permanent, I said. I understood that when we built her. The things built in response to specific failures rarely are. Someone builds the answer to the problem. The answer does what it needs to do, and then the world tries to move past the problem itself. That is how it is supposed to work. I stepped through the door. "That is fine," I said. "That is exactly how it should work." Outside the shipyard was running its normal operations. Certification teams moving between hangars, supply vehicles on their routes, the practical noise of an institution doing its work. No drama, no ceremony, just the ordinary, unspectacular business of keeping everything running that everything else depended on. I went back to my office and sat down. 6 months after the decommission order, the formal dismantling timeline was established. 22 months from the confirmation date, subject to concordant oversight scheduling. Petra had filed for 2 extensions on technical grounds and received one of them, which pushed the original 18-month timeline to 22. I had not asked her to do that. She did it because she believed in using every available option, which was, I thought, the right way to approach most things. Owen sent a message the day the timeline was confirmed. It said she had a good run. I wrote back, she had the run she was built for. He sent back a thumbs-up icon. Owen had been using thumbs-up icons in messages since before I had met him, and had never stopped. I found it comforting in a way I could not entirely account for, and did not try to. Yeva was at the academy when the announcement came through. She sent a short message. She said she had been talking to her students about the frontier deployment, not the classified technical details, but the principle of it. The idea that the most powerful thing a weapon system can do is not fire. That the presence of credible, unambiguous capability deployed without aggression can resolve a situation that no smaller tool can reach. She said one of her students had asked if that was a hopeful lesson or a frightening one. She had told them it was both. That was the point. 17 engineers started a new design file 3 months after the decommission order was finalized. None of them had been asked to. I did not know about it until one of them, a young engineer named Iris Blake, who had been on the Unconditional Surrender's final systems certification team, sent me a message requesting a meeting. She came to my office and sat down and placed a tablet on my desk with the composure of someone who has prepared what they want to say and is going to say it regardless of the response. "We have started preliminary design work," she said. I looked at the tablet. Very early stage, more questions than answers. But the questions were good ones, the kind that take years to answer properly and tend to end up somewhere worth going. "We are calling it Unconditional Surrender 2, she said, "for now. There may be a better name once we are further along." At the top of the design file in the header section, Iris had written a note. It said, "Because someone is going to build this eventually, might as well be us first." I read it twice. I thought about 50 years, about theoretical exercises in concordant research facilities becoming engineering programs, about the conversation I had told the tribunal they were not having, about the fact that the knowledge was in the record now, in 6 days of formal testimony, with specifications entered as exhibits, accessible to any species, with the clearance and the persistence to study what had been filed. The math was real, the physics were documented, it was only a matter of time. I looked up at Iris. "You have 17 people," I said. "Currently," she said, "you will need at least 30 for the propulsion system alone. Owen Clark is retired, but he answers messages. Call him." She stood and picked up the tablet. "I will." She left. I sat at my desk for a while after that. The shipyard was doing its work outside the window. The sun was at the angle it always reached at this time of the afternoon. The light falling across the far wall in the specific way it did every day. I pulled up the design file on my own screen. Iris had given me access already. I navigated to the systems architecture section, which was mostly placeholder text and empty fields, and I typed 4 lines of preliminary specifications from memory. Things I had been,